Welcome to Truth Watchers. I am Heath Henning. As I said last week, I'm going to interact with Dr. Thomas Howe's two recent books about Michael Heiser. His first book is titled The Unseemly Realm, right here. This will be the topic of today, published in November 2024. This book provides a critical assessment of Heiser's work. This book I highly recommend because it deals with Heiser's material to evaluate his complete system of thought. Howe's second book focuses on Heiser's book Reverse and Hermen and is limited in that scope. Dr. Howe earned his MA in Biblical Studies from Liberty University in 1992 and his PhD in Philosophy of Religion in 1998 from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Dr. Howe is currently a professor at Southern Evangelical Seminary, where he has taught apologetics and biblical languages since 1993. Relevant here is to emphasize that Howe has taught biblical languages since 1993, hence Howe is not ignorant of Hebrew. Much of Howe's critique is dealing with Heiser's hermeneutic method, or it may be more accurate to say Heiser's lack of hermeneutics. I had a brief chapter on the topic of Heiser's hermeneutics, and it is interesting that Howe identifies a lot of the same issues I only briefly mentioned. One of these major issues is that Heiser advertised himself as a Hebrew scholar, but frequently ignores and or twisted the Hebrew grammar. Heiser frequently acted as if his idea of a divine counsel is derived from reading the original Hebrew, and only Hebrew readers could understand this concept. I said in my very first article, I can read Hebrew and I'm not reading this out of the Bible. Howe gets the same point. It's simply untrue to say that only Hebrew readers will get the divine counsel concept out of the Hebrew Bible. Christian scholars have read Hebrew for centuries without reading Heiser's theological ideas into the Bible. Howe is just one more example of a competent Hebrew scholar that disagrees with Heiser's claims. Criticizing Heiser's comment from The Unseen Realm, Howe wrote in The Unseemly Realm, page 22 through 23, quote, "Here Heiser, who earlier said, 'I knew my Hebrew grammar,' ignores the Hebrew grammar in order to make the text fit his view. Not only does Heiser read into the text what it does not say, he also ignores what the text in fact does say, and then adds to the text what he needs it to say," unquote. In The Unseen Realm, Heiser refers to the book of Daniel, chapter 4, wherein the Aramaic word shamayin is used, which Heiser claims refers to gods of his alleged divine counsel. Heiser's argument for this conclusion is based on the fact that the word is plural. Howe noted on page 143, quote, "The problem here is that Heiser does not bother to tell his readers that the Aramaic word shamayin is always plural. There is no singular form of this word." In another place, in The Unseen Realm, Heiser discusses his views of the phrase "the image of God" from Genesis 1:26. Dr. Howe responds to Heiser's twisting the grammar to teach his false views. Dr. Howe writes on page 187, quote, "Heiser claims humankind was created as God's image, yet of all the possible uses of the preposition, Howe," referring to, it's an abbreviation for the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, Howe does not include as among the possible uses. Without explanation or justification, Heiser simply picks the use that fits his assumption and treats it as if this is the only possible meaning. This is frankly not honest, unquote. Again, this is a similar issue that I emphasized in my book. Heiser literally made up definitions for Hebrew, claiming he could do that because he was a Hebrew scholar. That is literally what he said. You can watch one of his YouTube videos about translating Genesis 1, wherein he literally makes such a comment. The problem is Hebrew and all languages have grammatical rules, and even though ancient languages had broader semantic ranges to words, they cannot be translated however one chooses, no matter what your level of education is. In my book, The Unbiblical Realm, I spent an entire chapter to search Hebrew lexicons to show Heiser had no premise to define the word Elohim as he did. But this is just one example of Heiser's twisting the Bible based on the alleged scholarship in Hebrew. And on we can go with further examples of Heiser twisting the grammar to fit his assumptions. In fact, Dr. Howe takes up the issue of Heiser starting with an assumption extensively. He frequently refers to Heiser as having his always already present filter or assumption to read into the Bible, and I would add other ancient texts. In fact, Dr. Howe's earliest critique of Dr. Heiser was his article from 2019 titled The Unseen Assumption. Heiser would often use his rhetoric to deride theology as if it was read into the Bible through centuries of Christian tradition. Heiser taught this produced false interpretations of the Bible, but at the same time, he would claim that his doctrine was within the context of historical Christian orthodoxy. Of course, he can't have it both ways. If he was within historical orthodoxy, but at the same time claimed interpreting the Bible through church tradition was wrong, that would logically cause conflict within his own views. He used this kind of rhetoric to deride traditional theology, but attempted to be accepted by Christians by saying he was consistent within the bounds of historical Christian theology. What he didn't bluntly say was what his assumptions were and how he read them into the Bible and his theology. Heiser's education was from secular universities. What he was taught was that the ancient Israelite religion evolved out of polytheism. People need to understand that evolution is not a science, but rather a philosophy. It is a philosophy because it's originated by ancient philosophers from pagan cultures, and Darwin knew this. He actually gave credit to Aristotle in the introduction of his 6th edition of Origin of Species. My point is that the philosophy of evolution is not limited to the secular view of biology as an idea for origins. Evolution is a philosophy that gets applied to all fields of thought, and in this context, the idea of how religions evolved in ancient societies. The secular view is that religious thought was originally animistic, evolving through polytheism, and eventually becomes monotheistic. This evolutionary view of religion was prominent influence coming out of Germany back between about 1890s until 1940 or so, when the view was predominantly rejected in most scholarly circles. Apparently, Heiser's circle of influence never got the memo to drop this outdated hypothesis of German skepticism. Actually, the strong growing line of evidence shows that monotheism was actually the earliest religious view in most ancient societies, and it degenerated into polytheism. Heiser was indoctrinated with this secular view of religion, and he never rejected the concept of it. He claimed Israel believed in a plurality of gods until after the New Testament. Because he was educated in this view, he always assumed polytheism was the earliest religious view, and therefore it would be wrong to read the Bible as monotheistic. It would be reading later church theology into the Old Testament. That's why he would say things like monotheism was anachronistic to apply to the Bible. Church theology, in Heiser's mind, became monotheistic as the natural process of religious evolution. By stripping what he assumed was church tradition, Heiser attempted to strip away monotheism to read what he assumed would be the original meaning of the Old Testament in its polytheistic setting. Dr. Howe writes on page 118, quote, "It is difficult not to notice the arrogance of Heiser's assertion. Heiser believes that the proper context of interpretation is not the history of Christian church or any of those throughout the history of Christianity who have engaged in interpretation, yet he thinks his interpretation is superior and that he is capable of passing judgment on all the biblical interpreters throughout Christian history." Unquote. 2 points should be made concerning this comment. First, obviously, Heiser didn't actually read Christian authors of our history. Heiser presented his view as authoritative because he went to the ancient literature to understand the ancient context of the Bible. However, all scholars throughout church history did this. If you read John Calvin, he references many ancient authors. If you read Augustine or earlier church fathers, you would see these men were well read. In fact, they had access to more ancient literature than we do today. Texts that are no longer extant today get pieced together by quotes from other ancient literature. An example of this is the Babylonian priest Berosus, who gave us the Greek version of the creation epic now known as Enuma Elish. Before George Smith discovered the Akkadian version in his excavation of Nineveh in the 1870s, we already had fragments of the Greek version from Berosus, which is predominantly pieced together from being quoted by the church father Eusebius. Here's the book Berosus and Manetho. Both of these ancient authors are pieced together by later ancient authors, and that's how we come to formulate their literature. We don't have access to Berosus' full work, but the church fathers did and quoted it, so they had a greater knowledge of the ancient literature than any modern scholar can obtain today. Secondly, it needs to be understood that Heiser's mentor for his doctoral work was Michael V. Fox, who wrote an article some years ago claiming people who believe the Bible can't accurately interpret the Bible because they are biased by their faith. Fox claimed believers cannot be scholars. Fox derided this faith-based studies. Heiser has evidently accepted this view since all the sources he cites in his footnotes are liberal scholars, absolute unbelievers. This is one more of the unmentioned assumptions of Michael Heiser. All these unbelieving liberal scholars assume the religious evolutionary worldview. That's who he's referencing to prove his divine counsel idea. Dr. Howe did not explain it in his book in this way, but noted on page 32, quote, a serious problem with Heiser's hermeneutic method is that he takes the ANE, Ancient Near East worldview, as the context through which one must interpret the biblical text, unquote. Of course, the Ancient Near East worldview was polytheistic. All the cultures of the Ancient Near East were pagan, hence polytheistic, during the Old Testament period. Heiser assumed that polytheism was true for Israel, but he ignored all the times the Bible condemned and commanded the Israelites to separate from the pagan cultures. Howe's book emphasizes the hermeneutic issues of Heiser and dedicates 3 full chapters to the topic. Many people think Heiser is talking about angels when he uses the word Elohim, but this is wrong. I have an entire chapter in my book, The Unbiblical Realm, on this topic because it is such a common misconception from those listening to Dr. Heiser. Dr. Howe also noted this on a couple occasions. Referring to Heiser's discussion about Job 38, Howe writes on page 220, quote, he immediately rejects the notion that the sons of God might be angels. Quoting Michael Heiser, we might think of them as angels, but that wouldn't be quite correct, unquote. Howe continues, why wouldn't this be quite correct? Heiser does not bother to explain why this would not be quite correct. Interestingly, both the Syriac and the Septuagint, the LXX, translates sons of God as angels, unquote. Elsewhere on page 268, Dr. Howe reminds us plainly, quote, Heiser does not include angels in God's counsel, unquote. Dr. Howe has his scholarship in philosophy, so you can expect that much of his arguments is going to point out that there are multitudes of logical fallacies in Heiser's writings. I noted a number of these in Heiser's thought, but my focus was intentionally on the historical sources to show Heiser manipulated these sources with deceptive methods. Dr. Howe, however, focused on the logical problems of Heiser's work. This is one reason why I would encourage others to read Dr. Howe's book. We address a lot of the same issues about Dr. Heiser, but approach them from different directions to show the flaws of them. One thing that Dr. Howe points out is the false dichotomy presented by Dr. Heiser. Heiser presented this dichotomy as if either you accept his views, which presents the supernatural worldview for interpreting the Bible, or you fall into a rationalist worldview and reject the supernatural worldview for the Bible. Heiser wrote in The Unseen Realm, page 17 through 18, quote, "My contention is that if our theology really derives from the biblical text, we must reconsider our selective supernaturalism and recover a biblical theology of the unseen world." This is not to suggest that the best interpretation of the passage is always the most supernatural one, but the biblical writers and those to whom they wrote were predisposed to supernaturalism. To ignore that outlook or marginalize it will produce Bible interpretation that reflect our mindset more than the biblical writers, unquote. Dr. Howe responds to this comment on page 7 of The Unseemly Realm, stating, quote, "Ultimately, what Heiser expects is that his readers accept his notion of the unseen world or be deniers of the supernatural," unquote. This is not only a logical fallacy on Heiser's behalf by presenting his false dichotomy, but it is part of his consistent rhetorical attack on people who disagree with his view. You either believe his false theology and interpretations, or you deny the supernatural worldview of the Bible. This point is elaborated on by Dr. Howe on page 121. He quotes Heiser, The Unseen Realm, page 16, quote, "We've been desensitized to the vitality of and theological importance of the unseen realm." Howe replies, quote, "Of course, what Heiser is saying is that we find talk about his interpretation of the supernatural world uncomfortable. Here again, he is poisoning the well. Without argument or evidence, he wants his readers to think that anyone who objects to his understanding of the supernatural world has necessarily been desensitized. Heiser precludes contrary views by disparaging them. Oh, you don't agree with my interpretation? That's just because you have been desensitized," unquote. Continuing on page 121, Howe again quotes Heiser, The Unseen Realm, page 17, quote, "The believing church is bending under the weight of its own rationalism, a modern worldview that would be foreign to the biblical authors," unquote. Dr. Howe quips back with the comment, quote, "It is painfully obvious that Heiser does not understand what rationalism is, but it is a quick way of earning brownie points among sympathetic readers," unquote. Again, these kinds of comments are manipulative rhetorical methods which Heiser's writings are overflowing with. Dr. Howe is right about Heiser not knowing what rationalism is. He uses this type of phraseology to deride theology of church tradition and history. Heiser particularly mentions Augustine and makes claims as if he was the one to first deny the angel's view of Genesis 6. Heiser is obviously unacquainted with reading the church fathers, since Augustine was neither the first nor the one who condemned the interpretation by setting it on a list of heresies. It was Peter of Alexandria who first proposed the Sethite view, and Jerome who condemned the angel's view. But this all occurred 1,000 years before the rationalist movement began. The philosophical view we identify as rationalism originates in the 17th and 18th century, long after the church fathers. So Heiser has a very awkward and inconsistent view of philosophy and utter ignorance of history. Sadly, his fans, the Heiserites, apparently are so gullible they can't see through these major blunders of Dr. Heiser. But I want to focus on the premise of this false dichotomy for a minute. Heiser seriously thought this way, and from my interactions with Heiserites, they do too. That is why they don't know how to handle me, since I don't fit their mold of a false dichotomy. I actually accept the angel's view of Genesis 6. And I accept a Satan-logical view for passages like Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. So I would sit within what Heiser calls the supernatural worldview of the Bible, yet I reject Heiser and his heretical views. I break this dichotomy he demands to set himself up as an authority. Dr. Howe, on the other hand, falls into Heiser's characterization. Howe takes the Sethite view of Genesis 6 and gives an elaborate expression on that in his book, Reversing Heiser. He also interprets Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 as references to human kings. Dr. Howe obviously rejects Heiser's view also. So the point I'm making is that it is not a supernatural versus rationalist interpretation that causes one to reject Heiser's false theology. It is Heiser's false theology that causes us to reject his false theology. Dr. Howe and I can stand on different positions as to how we interpret certain passages, but at the same time criticize Heiser's false doctrine, and often we criticize the same points about what Heiser said. In closing, again, I want to recommend Dr. Howe's book, The Unseemly Realm. Let me put it on the screen real quick. The Unseemly Realm, with the subtitle A Critical Analysis of the Writings of Michael Heiser. It delves thoroughly into Heiser's system of theology and presents arguments against Heiser's view that are different expressions from the arguments I presented in my book, The Unbiblical Realm. Dr. Howe is a philosopher, so you can expect him to take a different angle than I did, as I focused on history. I will interact with his second book, Reversing Heiser, next time. As I said before, that book is more limited in scope, dealing specifically with Heiser's book, Reversing Herman. See you next time. This is Heath Henning. Thank you for tuning into Truth Watchers podcast. Remember to hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend. For more fascinating facts, check us out at truthwatchers.com, because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children. As it is indicated in 3 John verse 4, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.